Harrison is helping me move forward. I went from being angry to happy, positive, and more lively.
I wanted to do something that I could be happy with, and they provided me with that.
Everybody is friendly. The people at the front desk knew me by name when I came in the front door.
There's always somebody there for you and always somebody pushing you.
I can't continue to talk the talk. I have to walk it now. That's why I started at Harrison.
The Harrison difference to me is the family atmosphere. You're just not a number here. You're somebody.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brian Gilday. I am the Vice President for Indianapolis Economic Development at the Indy Chamber, and I want to thank you for joining our webinar, Are You Export Ready? This webinar is being brought to you by Harrison College with support from U.S. Commercial Service. As a part of the Indy Chamber's economic development activities for the Indy Metro, export-focused programming and support services to small and medium-sized businesses to help navigate the international business market is an area of focus. Since launching the Metro Indy Export Plan, the Indy Chamber's existing resources have been expanded to support the growth of export companies to include free one-on-one business coaching, webinars like today's, global Indy events, and other resources to create a one-stop shop to assist in getting your businesses ready to export. Please visit indychamber.com/export for more information as we continue to add resources on a regular basis. With more than 2/3 of the world's purchasing power residing outside of the U.S., exporting goods and services is a real opportunity for growth for U.S. companies as demand for American-made goods becomes increasingly high. Not only does exporting help grow the bottom lines of companies, but it helps the greater community grow as well. Exporting companies typically pay nearly 20% more, and industries become more diversified in their customer base, making dips in market demand easier to navigate, and more globally minded community creates cultural awareness and diversity within our business leadership and even our neighborhoods. The objective of today's webinar is to help U.S. companies begin an export initiative and gain new skills in innovation and extending their international sales. In a moment, I'll turn the presentation over to Mark Cooper, Director of the Indiana Office of U.S. Department of Commercial International Trade Administration. But first, we do have a few housekeeping details to make sure everyone gets the most benefit from today's webinar. You'll be able to hear the presentation via your telephone and view it simultaneously via your computer. If you're not hooked up to both, please take a moment to do this. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please press *0 anytime during the presentation. I invite you to type in questions on your screen as they occur to you during the presentation. Mark will do his best to answer the questions as he goes, but we have also allowed 10 minutes of Q&A at the end of the presentation. There is a box at the bottom of the screen which you can click and type your questions anytime during the presentation. We will compile the questions and present as many as time allows after the presentation. Type questions which are not answered during the webinar due to time constraints will receive personal answers via email after the webinar. Now I'd like to introduce Mark Cooper, Director of the Indiana Office of U.S. Department of Commercial and International Trade Administration. The U.S. Commercial Service is a branch of the U.S. Department of Commerce that is an agency of the U.S. government. It is their mandate to promote the export of goods and services from the United States, particularly by small and medium-sized businesses. Mark has been an active part of the Indiana International Business Community for the past 17 years and has worked extensively in emerging markets throughout his career and is a true asset to Indiana business community. He holds a master's degree from Indiana University in Comparative and International Affairs and a bachelor's degree in Theology and Public Administration. Please help me welcome Mark Cooper. Mark, thank you.
Thank you, Brian, and thanks so much to the folks at the Indy Chamber for this opportunity to talk to you today. As Brian mentioned, we're going to discuss the topic, Are You Export Ready? Again, my name is Mark Cooper, and I'm part of the U.S. Department of Commerce, and my whole job is to help Indiana companies export. So let's get into our topic. First thing we're going to talk about is your company ready to go global? And so you have to assess your export readiness. And this is an important topic and an important issue to determine when you go global, how ready are you to in fact export? Do you have success selling in the U.S. domestic market? Are your levels of management committed to exporting with dedicated resources in place to be successful? This is important. It can't be just a sales guy that wants to export, but the management team has to have the vision and the perspective to make sure they're interested in the export process and they see their mission is to take the company global. Have you developed an international marketing plan with defined goals and strategies? Again, trying to plan for the future. I always tell companies it's better to use a rifle than a shotgun in promoting exporting. It's better to have a targeted focus rather than to look at a number of markets with real no defined plan. Another point you have to consider is if you have sufficient production capacity that can be committed to export markets, because it's important to be able to produce what you sell. And so if you look at foreign markets and you're not able to actually produce the product or meet demand, this could be a problem. Finally, are financial resources in place to actively support marketing of your products? So you have to have the money and the resources to target those overseas markets. Let's look at a few more issues in assessing export readiness. Are you committed as a company to providing the same level of service given to you to your domestic customers? This is important. You can't treat your foreign markets like an afterthought. You have to treat them like a viable business proposition. Are you able to modify your products? I get this all the time. I've worked with companies for many years. Different foreign markets, the products often have to be modified. Think of the metric system, things that are constituted in inches that actually have to be looked at in using centimeters and meters and things like this. So are you able to modify your product to meet foreign import regulations and cultural preferences? Oftentimes the nuances of a culture demand that you modify the product in a way that's sensitive to that culture. So you have to think about those things and be willing to do that. Do you understand logistics and the shipping process? Because again, this is an important part. You can't just sell the product, you have to get it to the actual consumer or buyer on the other end. And it's important to know something called Incoterms. Those are the shipping terms that companies use to get their products from point A to point B. Do you understand export credit options, such as letters of credit and export credit insurance through the Export-Import Bank? These are important aspects that you need to ask yourself as a company when you're determining your export readiness. So let's look at the topic, finding the best market entry approach. So you have to determine and find the best market entry approach for your product. And this is important. And there are factors that determine your market entry strategy. Number one, size of your firm. Number two, tolerance of risk. Number three, resources available to develop the market. Four, the nature of your product or services. And previous export experience and expertise. And finally, business conditions in the selected overseas market. These are things that you have to consider when you're saying or discussing how do I determine the best market entry approach. So these are the type of topics that you want to look at. There are challenges, of course, along the way. And there are things that each company and you as a business person and a person that's interested in international trade will have to consider. Some of the challenges include how to enter that market quickly and profitably. So one thing you must do, and one thing you need to do, is obtain appropriate market intelligence. And you need to learn about those markets in advance. You can't just say, well, everybody's going to China, so that's where I'm going to go, or everybody's going to pick a country. Don't use the U.S. news to determine your market entry strategy, but in fact, you need to do an assessment of how can I learn about potential markets and how my product either syncs with that market or is counter-cyclical to that market. So you have to understand those approaches. Finally, you have to address also legal and regulatory issues. So there are regulatory barriers in some markets. These can be barriers to entry. There could be non-tariff barriers as well as tariff barriers. So smart companies say, okay, it's not just the market itself, but what's the regulatory climate and how receptive are companies or our countries to my company's products? Companies tell me all the time or ask me all the time, Mark, what's a good rule of thumb for determining a market entry strategy? One thing I tell people is for them to consider U.S. free trade agreements. The U.S. has around 20 free trade agreements approximately that we've signed with other signatories from other countries. And so these free trade agreements give you roadmaps and markers for consideration as to what markets might be a good prospect for your product. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that it's a perfect option, but consider countries and markets where you have a limited duty structure and potentially free duty that you may be able to ship your product in there with no duty at all, that should be a viable option for you. You also have to locate qualified international buyers, distributors, and agents, and you also have to finance, of course, the deal that you're looking at. So let's look a little closer at finding the best market entry approach. And if you do that, you will see that, look at the size of your firm. We mentioned this a little earlier, but we're going to go a little bit further in depth. If you look at the size of your firm, do you have the human capital and the capacity to manage domestic and international sales? Again, my argument is that international sales can't be an afterthought. There must be somebody assigned to it, somebody to work at it. Somebody has to be a project manager and watch the pot, as I say, to make sure that if something is happening, it's not just, well, we don't know who's in charge of international. Are you selling enough domestically? This is important most of the time. It's a good indicator. If you don't have a good domestic sales market, it's pretty difficult, in fact, to sell internationally in markets where you don't understand the culture, you may not understand the language, you may not understand the logistics. It's much more difficult to do this if your domestic market isn't being served. So I always ask companies when they say, I want to go global, I say, well, great, so tell me how your domestic sales are going. So I think this is an important point. Also, your tolerance of risk, and this is a key factor. Some companies are very risk averse. And so when companies are risk averse, I tell them to look at Canada and Mexico, for example. We used to have a slogan in the Commerce Department, and my colleagues in Canada would say, think Canada first. And that was something that many companies considered. And so I tell them that depending on your risk tolerance, that you should look at these markets that are close by, or depending on your abilities, that you can consider how much risk you're willing to take. So there's financial risk, there's time risk, there's management risk, and then there's market specific risk, which includes the political infrastructure of the country. And these are valid concerns, and you have to think about them, because these ideas of risk can impact your strategy in the market. Sometimes a market that may look huge upon first inspection may not look so great when you figure out all the regulatory barriers and the duty barriers and the non-tariff barriers that may be you may have to face in doing business in that specific market. You also need to leverage your existing resources, and you need to leverage your existing distribution network. If you already have distributors in some markets, take the lessons you've learned by hiring initial overseas distributors and apply those to other markets. This is important. You can learn a lot of lessons from your distributor in Mexico that you can apply to other markets of Latin America. You also should consider working with trade promotion agencies. These are folks like my office, the U.S. Department of Commerce. As Brian had mentioned earlier, we work with embassies, U.S. embassies all over the world, and we connect you to these markets and try to help you enter them. You also consider and should consider contacting consultants or export management companies. These are folks who may be able to help you if you are not willing to do the work yourself. If you don't want to export proactively, you can often turn that to an export management company or an export trading company. As we progress in our discussion today, we will continue to discuss and to delineate different strategies that you can use, either direct or indirect exporting, that can help you determine a pathway forward when you determine you want to go global. So when we talk about the best market entry approach, and we've discussed this a little bit, but it's pretty important, and so we want to go into that in a little more depth. So when we're trying to determine the approach and the entry approach, we have to ask ourselves, and you need to ask yourself about the nature of your product. So what modification will your product or service need? And so, as I mentioned earlier about the metric system, I think this is an important part of that. But there can also be other things: packaging, color of that packaging, size of that packaging, electrical currents. All these things are modifications that products need to have consideration of when you're looking at foreign markets. Also, what tests and licensing. This is a really important factor and point that companies need to consider. Just because it is freely saleable in the United States, your product may not be freely saleable in a foreign country. There may be some type of licensing arrangement. There may be a pre-shipment inspection. There may be things like legalization, authentication, apostilles and things like this that make your product and the documentation that go with it saleable in a market. So you need to understand what type of certification process. So when does this matter? Well, it really matters in products that have a licensing or regulatory regime in the United States. One of those, of course, is medical devices and pharma and aerospace goods and things like this, which have licensing arrangements in the United States. But then we also have licensing regimes in foreign countries where foreign countries want to make sure that the product they're selling them is good for them, won't harm them, won't hurt them, won't do any kind of damage. And so you see there's many types of licensing arrangements. For example, if you do business in Europe, many American products need the CE mark, Certificate European, the CE symbols that you'll see if you turn over your cell phone. You'll oftentimes see on the back of your cell phone a little symbol for that mark, and it's a safety and security mark. And so companies need to say, what type of regulatory regime do I need to consider? Now, there is a cost, obviously, to fulfilling that regulatory requirement to doing business in Europe, but the benefit is having access to 400 million people or 500 million people of Europe and having access to all the 28 plus markets of the European Union. So there's a trade-off there. And so you need to understand, how do I need to make sure that my product fits the European market, for example. Then you can use that same analogy in Latin America or in Mexico, or any type of special regulatory considerations that you need to make for your product. The same thing goes with packaging. And when you're shipping your product, there's a number of regulatory regimes that Europeans, for example, are concerned about. RoHS and we are two of them, and many of the folks on this webinar may know all about them. But this is the disposal of hazardous waste and products and chemicals and things like this that European regulatory bodies want to make sure that a U.S. firm regulate. So you have to make sure you're compliant with that. So if you have a product that has a waste stream attached to that has an end of life cycle, that's an electronic product, these are all compliance issues that you need to consider. You also need to look, as I mentioned earlier, about the previous export experience that you've had, build on those lessons you've learned in some markets and apply them to other markets as well. You also need to look at the business conditions in the overseas markets. What's going on politically? You read the newspaper, you turn on the news, you try to find out what's that cultural and political climate that can impact my business. A good example of that, and we'll allude to this a bit later in the presentation, is Russia. While Russia is a vast and a giant market, obviously the political considerations at this time make it something that you have to consider. How is that going to impact my sales? So anytime there are political currents, I guess you could say, in the offing, you have to consider how would that political infrastructure and those issues determine or impact my sales. So what I'm saying is, what are the political and financial risks? Then you have to look at the economic idea and say, what in fact are the competitive risks? How competitive is my product? And I want to make sure that we talk about this for just a couple more seconds, but people ask me that all the time, and you have to determine your comparative advantage. And this is an important point that most companies, I think all companies need to say. Why a foreign company am I going to buy from you? I remember years ago I had a company that came to me that sold zero turning radius mowers, the mowers that can turn on a dime, and they were wanting to sell those in Europe. And I asked the client the simple question, well, do you think about the yard sizes of Europe? Many Europeans live in apartments. They live in small spaces. They don't have a lot of room. These giant yards are not as common for many people. So we have to make sure that your product fits the market. So this is about identifying the landscape, the competitive landscape for your product, and just how do people interact with your product in a foreign market. Let's go into some market entry strategy concepts, and one of those is the indirect market entry strategy. And this is what I mentioned earlier in the presentation, talking about when you don't want to go direct yourself. There are companies, and I work with them, who say, hey, I want to do global business, I want to export, I want to do more outside the country, but we're strapped. We just don't have either the resources, the knowledge, the time, or the inclination to do it ourselves. we'd rather outsource that exporting to a third party, an export management company, an export trading company. And so there are three main types that we're going to consider today. And one of those is, as I alluded, the export management company or export trading company. Then there's piggyback exporting, where you go on, you basically piggyback, as the word says, onto another client or partner's existing export operations, and you sell on the same channel as a colleague or a firm that you're friends with. You use their channels of distribution to market your products. Obviously, those are complementary goods. They're not competing goods. Your competitors are not going to say, "Sure, use my channels of distribution to compete with me." But you'll find companies that have complementary goods that may look at that. And you see this in the automotive industry, for example. People who supply to tier one suppliers, they oftentimes will look at those markets that the big three, for example, have charted globally, and they'll supply those markets. They'll piggyback into those markets, and sometimes even use their distribution streams to make sure that they can supply those markets. And sometimes the original manufacturer, the OEMs, mandate you've got to come into this market with me. So that's a more of an indirect strategy. And then, of course, there are domestic distributors and gray marketing that some consider, that I don't think you should consider, but that's a strategy that some use. Then when you want to say, when should I use an indirect strategy? I think that's important. So we've decided, or you've decided as a company, you don't want to do it directly. You want to use an indirect strategy. When do you do this? When an indirect strategy makes sense is when your company is new to export. You've never exported before. You think, hey, I see the market, but we're just not big enough to do this. Exporting can be a short or medium-term goal. So you want to get out there. You're trying to access a foreign market. You don't have the resources in place. You don't have the structure in your company in place to do it. You don't have an international sales department. I remember I've been to many companies where people would say to me, or I would sit around the conference table and we would chat about exporting, and someone would say, yeah, we're really interested in this exporting our product globally. I'm going, great, this is excellent. So I'd say, well, tell me, Joe, for example, who is in charge of exporting at the company? And there's this long pause, and people look around the table, and they'll point to the shipping guy and say, oh, it's him. And he goes, oh, thank you very much for making me in charge of this today. So this whole idea of knowing who can be in charge of the export process, this is important. And so indirect exporting makes sense for companies who don't have the infrastructure in place to actually sell globally at this time. So your focus can be on domestic growth, and you look at exporting as an offshoot of that. And also folks who have, or companies who have, a low risk tolerance. They're either financial, commercial, or political risk are too great for them, and so they consider using an indirect strategy, market entry strategy that I outlined in the previous slide to enter the market. So let's look, if we will, a little bit at some of the pros and the cons to doing indirect exporting. And I think this is very important, so I want to make sure that everybody has an idea about this and is comfortable. First of all, there are some pros. You don't need as much experience. Management team is not distracted. You get a faster entry into the international market, and there's low financial commitment. You're not having to expend all the resources. You're outsourcing that to a third party. Those are some benefits to that. There's low risk, low cost, and then you don't have to maintain an overseas presence. But obviously, there's some cons to doing that. When you outsource that, when you let someone else do that for you, and your international presence is in the hands of someone else, then obviously there's a trade-off. Obviously, there can be inadequate market feedback. We're looking at cons now. Some of these export marketing companies, they tell you they can do the job, but maybe they can't. Maybe they don't know what they said that they know. Maybe they're not as experienced as you thought they were. Maybe their skill level is a little bit deficient. Maybe their access is limited. And so you're relying on people to take your brand into a market, and this may or may not be good. You can have poor control over the sales and marketing. You can have potentially lower sales, and you can have a higher risk due to your damage to your reputation that could occur possibly if the indirect marketing strategy fails. All right, let's look at direct market entry. U.S. company can engage directly with an entity in a foreign market. You can have either a sales representative, an agent, distributor, or you can have a licensing arrangement, or you can have franchising, overseas marketing offices. These are all things that you can do to enter this market directly, and this is something I'm a bit more familiar with. When does a direct marketing strategy make sense? When the company is new, but they have some moderate experience in exporting, when exporting is a goal of the company, when they have domestic sales growth, and when they're willing to take some risks to enter that market. This is when a more direct strategy makes sense. So let's take a minute or a few minutes to look at some of those types of strategy. One of those is a sales representative. An overseas sales representative is the equivalent of a manufacturer's representative in the United States. The representative uses your company's product literature and samples to present the product to potential buyers. Ordinarily, a representative handles many complementary goods. So this is a sales representative approach. And many of you, as we mentioned, are familiar with the manufacturer's representative. Now let's go on and look at agents or representatives. The term agency is very complicated in foreign markets, and typically we don't recommend that companies look at the agency model because often an agent in the term can bind you. They represent you. They are you in this market. So it's a misunderstood term, and they can actually have power of attorney when you're talking about an agent. Well, if you don't want to give your distributor power of attorney or your representative, you don't want to call them an agent in your agreement. So we oftentimes will use a term representative instead of an agent. Of course, the more traditional strategy is to use a distributor. Distributors are folks that purchase goods from a U.S. exporter and resells them for a profit. This is the most common model. The foreign distributor generally provides support and services for the product, and this relieves the U.S. exporter of those responsibilities. You're selling the product to the exporter, to the distributor, and he is marketing in the country. And they often handle a range of non-competing and complementary products. Let's move on. We're just going to touch on a few of these things because time is getting away from us here. But we want to talk a little bit about technology licensing. This is a contractual arrangement where the licensed patents or their trademarks or their services are things like this are being sold and made available to a licensee in a product. And this is negotiated in advance. So you're licensing a technology to someone in a foreign market. Another strategy can be to franchise. Form of technology licensing used by many in the service industry. We know about these type of franchising opportunities in global markets. When you're traveling overseas, you'll see a Papa John's or Kentucky Fried Chicken. You'll see a lot of these things in foreign markets where there are franchisees, and they continue to support the operation of the franchisee's business by providing support and advertising and things like this. There are pros and cons, of course, to direct marketing. When you're looking at direct marketing, the idea is that you have direct control. You have excellent feedback from the customer, and you have opportunities for greater sales when you're doing direct sales. But of course, you have to spend more time. You have to spend more money. It can take longer. International sales and international business, I believe it's a contact sport, but often it can take time. So it's important for you as a company to realize that it's not sometimes as quick as the U.S. market. It can take a little more time by going direct. So now let's talk a little bit about foreign direct investment. And this is the type of goal when your company is an experienced exporter, when exporting is a longer term goal, and when you're willing to accept a higher level of risk. We have different forms of FDI. You'll see on the slide. We won't have time to go into them in great detail, but these are different types of foreign direct investment in the market: a sales office, a marketing office, overseas distribution. These are all different types. Joint ventures, which are common. The point we have to make about this is it's more risk. So what's your level of risk tolerance, again, that we alluded to earlier? They can be higher risk. You can have facilities in those markets. You can have staffing issues. You can have market perception. You can have tax and accounting issues. So these are all issues that you need to determine if you're interested in doing a more direct strategy. I believe in a direct strategy, but it's that level of direct involvement that you want to consider. That's why oftentimes we talk about using a agent or distributor, especially a distributor, to market your product in foreign markets. This is just a brief commercial about our office, and that's my job, is to help you as an Indiana company sell your products around the globe. And this is leveraging my office, the U.S. Commercial Service, and the programs that will help you enter the market. Brian already alluded to who we are and what we do. We're connected to basically all the embassies overseas. We're in over 80 countries. We have offices in over 105 cities across the U.S., and we promote U.S. goods and services abroad. So I want to help you go global. That's really the story and the purpose of my presenting to you today. And we looked at the strategy scenario when we said we work with you, and you'll see on the slide here, to connect your company with the right opportunities abroad. Whereas if you want to determine export readiness, with that, identifying key markets, determining sales potential, and implementing an export plan, those are all things that we'd like to work with you on. These are some of our services. One of them is our Go Key Matchmaking service, where we help you find partners in these markets. We also do matchmaking in various entities. We work on trade missions, so we have a lot of tools to help you go global. You'll also see that we do some background checks, we do due diligence and things like this. These are all services that we help you and provide to you as an Indiana company trying to do business globally. Now let's, as we close up our analysis, just a quick run through of when you're looking at countries and when you're looking at specific markets. You can see our example company here is a global diagnostics firm, and they are looking at 3 markets that make sense for them. So they're trying to say, where should we really do business? We're a diagnostics firm, and we want to know, where we could do business, and so we want to have a strategy for going into those markets. And so one of the markets that you see, or the 3 target markets in this case, are Australia, India, and Russia. And those markets have different levels of risk tolerance, different issues that you must face when you're looking at those markets. You'll notice Australia, for example, smaller market, competitive, but relatively easy access. India, large market, fractured, has a medium level of access. Russia has high needs, resource intensive, very challenging access. So you can see on a continuum, these are how you have to look at your markets and look at your company and say, how do I analyze the countries that I want to do business in, and what's the level of risk? Now, we don't have time to go into the great detail on the markets of opportunity, but you'll see from our analysis, here's Australia. These are the pros and cons of doing business in the country and the issues that you would face if you were looking at a smaller market, but it's easier access. Then if you moved up to India, you would see that India has a larger market, but there are regulatory barriers. There are issues that you must face. This, of course, is an example of a medical company, but we could see this in any sector. And then if you look at the country of Russia, you'll see that there are markets of opportunity there, but there are obviously difficulties where you would have to make sure that this, even though it's a challenging market, there are opportunities, you may have barriers that you would have to face. So this is basically an encapsulation of 3 different market strategies that you could consider during our webinar. We only had a brief time to discuss them, but you can see on a continuum, as a company, you have to say, what is my strategy? What is my target? How am I going to enter these markets? We want to look at those. The bottom line is, for me, is we want to help you go global. I believe that international trade is a contact sport, and the Indiana companies, we punch above our weight, and we are experienced at exporting, and we want to go global to an even greater degree. Here's my contact information on the screen, and you'll note that if I can do anything to assist you and help you in the export process, whether it's targeting a new market or finding regulatory questions and answering them, I'd be glad to do that. I want to thank the Indy Chamber today for their great help here today and their kind consideration to let me present to you as part of this export boot camp, and also helping you be export ready. I believe you can do it. As an Indiana company, you can go global. It's all about knowing that international trade, as I said, is a contact sport. I want to tell you, you can do it. You can succeed in global markets. We have to, because this is the way the world is growing and going. You have to compete and win in global markets. I'm here to help you do it. Thanks. I'm Mark Cooper with the U.S. Department of Commerce.
Thanks, Mark. We have time for a few questions. I want to go into those. I do want to say Mark's a great partner with us. It was mentioned earlier that we launched our export strategy earlier this year, and the services that are provided by U.S. Commercial Services are key. They are varied, and sometimes they're under-realized, I think is a good term for that. So hopefully this is something today that you'll all be able to access and learn from as we go forward. So I want to jump into these questions since we're a little bit limited on time. First question we have, I am looking to export a service, not a product, and I was wondering how any of this would be applicable in my line of work since we are not shipping a tangible product, but actually a service overseas.
Sure. Thanks, Brian. Well, we help service companies as well. I've helped software companies, architectural firms, people with publishing issues. So services are exporting. And in fact, as you probably already know this, service exports are a great percentage of our current trade balance. So we're glad to help even insurance companies. I've assisted them as well. So we're willing to work with service companies. We just have to know that with the service business, there are different hurdles, and often there are regulatory issues to consider. But yes, I'd be glad to help with service exports as well.
Next question I have is, do you offer any in-country customs compliance requirement tools for entry?
Sure. We do help with customs issues and compliance issues. We have a number of databases that can tell you what are the requirements for getting a product into a country. And in fact, we do that all the time. A company will call me and say, hey, Mark, what are the regulatory requirements for getting my product into Brazil? This is one I get all the time. And if I don't know the answer or we don't have it, we can actually contact the embassy on your behalf and ask them those questions. So this is a great resource, and I want to make sure any companies can use it.
Very good. Thank you. We're about out of time. I do want to make everyone aware and remind them that this will be available on our website. Please visit indychamber.com/export. I want to also mention we have 3 more webinars that we'll be presenting this year. On August 19th, we have Global Marketing Communications, Discover and Connect with New Customers. On October 21st, we'll have a webinar, Pathways to Global Markets, Trade Fairs, and E-Commerce. And then on November 18th, Entering into Foreign Distribution and Sales Representative Agreements, the 5 things you should know to maximize your profit and protect your image. I want to thank Mark for being here today. One thing he did mention was the indirect strategy. When we did our export strategy, we talked with numerous companies, and the takeaway I had from experienced exporters and those considering exporting is take small steps, find your points of entry, find what resources are available, and work with people in those countries to get going, which is what I think you really focused on when you talked about the indirect strategy or working with a distributor. So those are key takeaways that I've had through the entire process. But again, I want to thank everyone for joining us. We will have additional webinars coming forward. Mark, thank you. As mentioned, you've been a great partner for us, and the services that you provide are key, and I hope this helps people raise their awareness of the tools that are out there as they look at exporting globally as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.